everyone, welcome back. We are taking a look this week at the Industrial Revolution. We're starting to see some of those major ideas, major leading factors towards potentially global conflicts that are going to result in getting closer and closer in the eventual outbreak of World War One. So today we are taking a look at the Industrial Revolution, where and why did it start that it did, and then some of just the major advancements that came along with it. So, technology, different inventions, different ideas that are now spreading, and then we're going to take a look at society. How did society change by the Industrial Revolution's spread? All right, buckle up, let's go. So, why Europe? Why is our industrialization revolution not starting in America? Why is it not starting in Africa or Asia, right? Well, we find that the Industrial Revolution primarily begins in Britain, and there's a couple of different reasons for this. Well, we have the resources that are plentiful in Britain. As we have kind of learned up to this point, coal was the primary resource in getting the steam engine starting, and then that kind of just spurred all of these different new inventions that allowed the eventual eruption of the Industrial Revolution. Now, in Europe, when we consider why not Africa, why not the Americas, why not Asia, throughout our study of history, we begin to see that Europe, yeah, they have revolutions, but for the most part, there aren't major changes or shifts happening in society. Okay, so Europe has a long and stable line of leadership. And so when you have that stable leadership, there's predictability, meaning that people are able to be prosperous. They're able to flourish and have new ideas because they aren't in survival mode. Okay, so that's what we see happening there in Europe as people are comfortable enough to really start questioning the world and wanting to improve what's around them. When you have political stability and a long line of leadership, most of the time you're going to have a lot of money. Okay, and you need money in order to invest in different resources or to build what's necessary in order to become industrialized. Now, while this did start in Europe and primarily in Britain, Germany and France and the United States do later catch up to this whole spread of industrialization. And again, it's because they have the resources that are available. Okay, so again, we're looking at that coal, looking at timber, and that's what is really the driving force during this time. So continuing on of like why Europe, we also see that in Europe there's a lot of people. There's a large population explosion. Again, political stability, having money. People are going to have families because that's what happens when there's stability in population in society. As you can see here in the chart on the right, we have the population of England specifically, and we can see that sharp incline once we hit the 1800s. And so, because there's more people, there's more ideas kind of floating around. And once we start having factories, there is a large population of workers ready to go. Now, what's going on in the rest of the world? Well, the United States, they're busy during this time fighting a civil war, so they don't have political stability. Russia does not have political stability. During this time, we're getting into the Russian Revolution. They're fighting back against the Tsar family and just ideology as a whole. And Japan, which we know was pretty industrialized or pretty with it, the last we heard from them back in the 1500s or so, they really didn't have the resources. Remember, they're an island and they are very isolated from the rest of the world, so they make do with what is on the island. So, because they didn't have the basic resources that were necessary, such as coal, such as a lot of timber, they weren't able to start off well. Okay, but they do end up catching up in the late to mid 1800s as their leaders do end up putting a high priority on going out to the world and starting to modernize, right? It's kind of like a keeping up with the Joneses, where you want to be the best and you want to keep up with what everyone else is doing. So, how did the Industrial Revolution start? Well, with the use of coal, that resource, again, that was plentiful in Britain, people were able to harness the power of it. Okay, so what happens is that you're able to keep a longer lasting heat source. And with that heat source, you're able to create steam, and that steam creates movement of air and power. And so once you have that, you have a continuous movement. You're able to then kind of have an engine, right? So because we now have coal and the steam engine starting up, now we've got railroads and automotives, right? The early versions of cars, right? The T model. Okay, and so because that is new ways of transportation, we're also going to see that more goods are traveling around to the rest of the world. So people are moving more, goods are moving more, and when you put a mix of that, you're going to make more money, which is going to just go back into the industry and be able to make more, produce more. It's this continuous cycle of making money, producing goods, selling it, and then going back to making money, right? So we see that the industry is going to be spreading from Britain to the rest of the world slowly but efficiently. Now, looking at the Industrial Revolution as a whole, what was happening? Other than obviously new machinery, what's happening with the people? Okay, we see this shift towards rapid urbanization. Okay, and when I say urbanization, that's a pretty important term that, especially as historians, we want to know what that means. Urbanization is this movement of people away from the countryside into these large cities. They're moving to get availability, they're moving to make money, a new way of life, because now there's more accessibility again into getting a job and to having an apartment with your family. So once these people are moving into these major city hubs, they're getting jobs. And during this time, it was kind of like the Wild West of what is going on with factories. And so we end up seeing long working hours and in pretty bad conditions. Okay. A lot of times it was very unsafe to be working around this big machinery. A lot of times children were going in and fixing the machinery because they had smaller hands or smaller arms and they could fit inside of things. And so, because there was such a large population at the time, owners of factories really didn't care if someone got hurt because then they could just find someone off the street tomorrow to replace them. So, as we have these long working hours, we're also seeing large quantities of goods being produced. Okay? And because of these goods being produced, again, we're seeing a shift in how countries are modernizing, what they're making, and what their status is around the rest of the world. So, we start to see some superpowers really shining during the Industrial Revolution. So, we've got Britain, the United States, France, and Germany. Again, they have the resources in order to industrialize, they have the population. Okay, and so with those two working forces, they're able to start really building up those factories and producing goods. So let's start getting into the fun part of looking at the Industrial Revolution. What was actually being made? What new advancements were coming out during this time? Well, the first factories were developing what we call textiles. And textiles is just another word essentially for cloth. Okay, so we're looking at yarn, wool, clothing, that kind of stuff. And that was a big shift because originally that was something that you did in the home, right? Mothers and daughters and young children, they worked together to make the cloth. And it was a homestead job. Well, now factories are starting to create this material and they're mass producing it. And so we see this shift away from like doing things inside your home as a family to going out and shopping and buying these different goods. We were able to mass produce all of the items that I'm going to talk about today because of this um, assembly line theory, or we see the assembly line start to be used. This was actually created originally by Henry Ford, who was from the Detroit Dearborn area of Michigan, and he first used this production in order to create cars. Now, the assembly line is when workers are standing in one place and the line and goods move past them. So instead of workers moving from place to place, the goods are moving along this conveyor belt. And it is the workers' one job. They continuously do one job over and over. So you don't have one person making an entire product. Instead, you have one person doing a little job for a lot of different products. And it made it go faster, and it made goods identical, meaning that you could have anyone could get access to all of these different products or goods that are now being created. So mass production definitely changed during this time. Now we're able to do this, again, have these multiples of identical products because of interchangeable parts. And we see this really still today. You go into a furniture store and there's multiples of one furniture piece. Okay, so same theory here. We're seeing multiples of a product and they all have the same components. So now we're able to fix components. Now we're able to make it cheaper in order to own it, because you can just go buy another one or you can buy a broken part and fix it yourself. Okay, still looking at that technology, we see a major change in the actual building products, right? What goes into making a physical building within the cities? Steel production. Okay, so with steel production, this is by Henry Bessemer and William Kelly. They started to play with the chemistry that went into making this type of metal combination. And so because they started to play with it, they were able to develop a newer process for making steel, where the steel was lighter, but it was also harder and more durable than iron. And so instead of having buildings made out of timber or this really expensive iron that is eventually going to rust, now you've got steel, and we're building our buildings up higher, creating skyscrapers, and we're able to build quicker because the steel is lighter, it's not as hard to move around from place to place. Again, seeing that development of cities going up and going out in size and geography-wise. We also start to see, as far as technology, some new chemistry innovations, such as soap, perfumes, aspirin, and when you think about it, the Industrial Revolution was what, like 150 years ago at this point? So, mass production of soap, perfumes, medicines like aspirin, it wasn't for the average person. Okay? It was a stinky time around the world. And now that you have these mass productions, it completely changes how humans are interacting with each other, because now you don't have to hide away from someone if they smell, and it encouraged the showering and bathing of an individual. So again, encouraging healthy living for these different populations around the world. Okay, as we're also looking at chemistry, it's important to note that Alfred Nobel invented dynamite. Okay, dynamite is a combustion tool that we even still see used today. And because of his invention, it's going to again change the way that weaponry starts to look. Okay, that's a big thing as we think about, okay, how did the Industrial Revolution even play a role into how World War I started or turned out? We're starting to see weaponry being mass produced at this point. Definitely going to change how countries are reserving those stocks or equipping their military in order to defend their countries. During this time, we see the invention of electricity. Okay, as we know, we all have electricity at every point in our lives throughout the day, and it's this new source of energy. Okay, Thomas Edison was the person that invented the light bulb, and so cities start to invest in this new source of energy. And instead of having a dark world once the sun goes down, now you are able to light up streets, you're able to light up homes, not just living by candlelight anymore. Okay, again, that is completely changing the way that an average person's day looks. Okay, previously to this, the sun goes down, you're done for the day, you go home to your families, and you don't really go back out until the sun is up again. Well, now we're able to have longer work days again. As a human, you're able to be out longer into the night without having to worry about your safety or anything like that. Next, we're taking a look at what new types of communication was developed during this time. Well, obviously, we know the steam-powered engine was able to increase railroads, right? Because we now have the steam engine. So we're seeing people connected throughout the world. Instead of just living in your small town and never really leaving to go anywhere, now the average person can travel. And they don't have to just stay put in their one part or one corner of the world, okay? We see the automobile at the turn of the 20th century, in the 1900s. This was possible because of the internal combustion engine. And after this design, as you see here on the right, started to be able to be mass produced, again, using that assembly line system, that design just really took off. As I mentioned earlier, Henry Ford is the one who has been credited with coming up with this idea, and all around the world, this process of an assembly line is still used today in order to have high rates of production. Just a few years later, we start to see the invention and toying with the idea of airplanes. Again, they're using that internal combustion engine, and we credit the Wright brothers with creating the design of a flying craft that people are able to be in. Again, we see the effects of this still today. We have very advanced airplane systems, and we're even able to take airplanes over the oceans. So again, we're just increasing that amount of communication and traveling from one place to another. Finally, if you are someone who would prefer not to travel, we see the original telephone, or the first type of use of long distance communication, in the form of the telegraph. Okay, Samuel Morse created a system using this device where between dots and lines and pauses and the different combination and variations of using those three things, you are able to send codes over long distances using wires. And so someone would be at the other end of that wire with knowledge on how to read that code. So we can get messages from one side, the east side of the United States, all the way over to the west side of the United States. And it's quick, much faster than someone on horseback, as it previously would have been, or even someone trying to walk. Next, we're taking a look at medicines. Okay, so how did medicine and some of those science thoughts and theories really develop during this time? Well, obviously, we know that the population size was greatly increasing, and that is thanks in part to medicines and starting to understand really how does the human body work and how do we respond to these different aggravators that are causing people to pass away. So, some of the big ideas that came out of understanding the human body, we've got first the germ theory. Okay, so understanding that there are microorganisms that live alongside humans just at a microscopic level, and understanding that these germs lead to infection and they lead to sickness. So once we're able to understand how these germs work, what is the biology when we really break it down, we're able to find a way to fight them off and we're able to help our immune systems and our bodies know how to fight off these germs when we do come in contact with them. So we really start to see the use of vaccines. Okay, we develop a vaccine for rabies and anthrax, and later on, even tuberculosis, which was a major killer for the average person. It was an infection in the lungs, and it made it really hard to breathe, and it was very, very infectious. Hospital life also improves later on. We create anesthesia for surgery, so instead of having someone be awake while their body is undergoing surgery, now we're able to put them under safely, which lowers the amount of shock that a body is going to go into, and then later help the healing process after a surgery. Now, Joseph Lister, he's kind of a person of prominence, as he found that sterilizing surgical instruments would help prevent from infection. As we sterilize surgical instruments, it's able to remove the bacteria and germs that were alive on it. And so when you sterilize it, you're not introducing those things into a already weak human body. So again, we're really seeing people be able to get sick and then recover from it safely. It isn't just a death sentence anymore if you are to come in contact with some of these germs or bacteria. As far as science, we see a lot of major developments. So let's focus first on kind of like world science. Geology and that idea of how do we study the earth, how do we look at soil, how do we make maps, all of that is starting to come into play. And as people are starting to question this, they're really starting to question, well, how old is the earth? We only know of it as long as there's human record, but was the earth obviously here before humans? Who lived here? All of those different things. And so one scientist that really started to question human species and what kind of creatures were here on the earth before us was a scientist that was by the name of Charles Darwin. He was known for traveling to the Galapagos Islands and studying the different creatures because the islands that he went to, they're very cut off from the rest of the world. And so he was able to see how does their family lines of animals compare to the family lines, say, on the mainland of the world? And how do babies differ for the different type of species that he was looking at? So he creates this theory of evolution and Darwinism, where it was basically survival of the fittest, and whoever survived later then mated, evolved in order to again keep surviving. So this theory that humans didn't just come on the earth as a human form really starts to play a role in society. Okay, so Charles Darwin was arguing that humans and any other living thing has evolved over time, okay, through this natural selection or survival of the fittest again. Now, while this theory was used for just like the human species as a whole, it does end up playing a major role in different racist arguments that crop up throughout the world, and even more so in the United States, as we see still some issues following the Civil War and Reconstruction era. And so this idea of what is this superior race, how have people evolved, it really starts to play a negative role, and again, leading to some very racist stereotypes. Finally, we're taking a look at some of those chemistry things. We start to see the idea of the atomic theory coming out, where we're questioning what is the world made up of, and we see this theory that all matter is made up of small particles. I'm sure you'll definitely hear more about this if or once you take chemistry. So finishing up with our science category here, looking at the Industrial Revolution, we're really then going to take a look at, okay, all of this industry and the pollution that comes from it obviously has to go somewhere. So what happens because all of these side effects from factories are going out into the world. So let's take a look at the environmental impacts of the Industrial Revolution. This new waste coming from factories and coming from coal use and a lot of coal being burned going out into society, as we can see here on the picture on the right, it's going out into the atmosphere. And then it comes back down onto the ground and it's contaminating the ground, making it unsafe to drink from and be able to grow even plants from. So it was this idea of like, well, whose job is it to protect the environment? That had never really been questioned up until this point in time. So governments start to step in and say like, all right, we need to start having some new rules, some regulations in order to protect people from the runoff and the air pollution that's coming from all of these cities and factories. Also, we see as there's more population, we need to have more food. And because of the different technology for farming equipment that came into use, we see the overuse of soil. So farms are even starting to suffer a little bit because of these new inventions. Yes, at first you're able to create a lot of food quickly and get it out to the population, but eventually, if you don't know soil science, then you're going to essentially take all of the good nutrients out of the soil. And you aren't going to be able to keep growing crops there anymore because essentially the soil is dead and it no longer will be able to harvest crops. So we start to see these different social movements spring up around the world in order to protect the environment as they're seeing firsthand some of those effects that this pollution is having to the greater world around us. We see some different movements and even legislation that is passed in order to protect humans as well as the environment that we're living in. One of those movements and legislation pieces that was created was the 1962 Morrill Land Act. Okay? And this, I think it's, yeah, it essentially was a land grant, so money that was given to states from the federal government in order to create colleges and universities in order to teach people about the environment and how can we interact with the environment in a healthy way that is going to be sustainable. Actually, MSU is one of these universities that was created because of the Morrill Land Act. And it was a place where children of farmers or people who were interested in the environment could go and learn how to be a better farmer, learn about how does soil work, what is the chemistry of soil, and that's one of their primary degrees still to this day is being able to be an agricultural university. All right, now that we've gotten through what was the technology of the Industrial Revolution, let's take a look at the people that were living during this time. What was life like and what were the different changes that they were experiencing in a short amount of time? Well, first off, we have a new middle class. And we have a new middle class because now more people are working and more people have access to goods because goods are being produced cheaper. And so when you have money, you have access to buy things, it creates this new level in a social hierarchy. So instead of just having peasants and nobles and that's it, now you have all of these different little factions. You have poor, you have lower middle class, you have upper middle class, and then you still have nobles or rich people. Now, the middle class, what was life typically like for a middle class person? They were typically going to be your lawyers, your doctors, teachers, large business owners. They were the people that had jobs, had money, were exposed to that culture of a rich person, but they weren't the very top of society. They weren't the ones making laws, they weren't the ones leading armies or anything like that, but they still had that experience and exposure to rich life. Many times, middle class, you are expected to take care of your home, So this is really when we start to see the Victorian era of architecture come about. These grand homes, very elaborate, because that was how middle class families were able to show off their life. Now, what did life look like for poor or lower class people? They were going to be living in small, cramped city apartments. And when I say small, cramped city apartments, I mean there could be a family of 8 people living in a one-room apartment. And typically, these are the people who are working your factory jobs that are very dangerous or they are very unhealthy. And so, because they don't really have the option to not be employed, this is the group and the part of society that is not being paid very well, yet they're working the most dangerous jobs. Now, as far again as society, home life and the way that the structure in the home changed pretty significantly. Women are now taking care of the home. And meanwhile, men were going to work. Children, they were to be seen and not heard. So while the men are off at work, women are at home taking care of the menu, they're cooking, and they're tending kind of to the children. Most of the time, your upper middle to rich families had additional caretakers or servants who would work for them, live in home with them in an apartment off the side of the house, and they would be working with the children while the women of the house were taking care of the actual house. Now, there were a lot of struggles between the social classes. As we saw earlier just now, poor families looked quite different than a middle class family. What their living conditions were like, what kind of jobs they were working. So there were definitely struggles between the social classes. And as people started to recognize, like, hey, this isn't fair, we see new labor movements being created. As we can see here in the bottom right picture, this is a picture of a protest where workers are coming out asking for change, asking for better working conditions. As industry is still building, we see a lot of different companies spring up, we see different businesses, products, and it creates this idea of capitalism. Now, this is a form of an economy, and it is basically the idea of survival of the fittest, where there's not going to be a lot of government intervention, and you're not really making products in home anymore. So, with all of these different businesses, if you're going to survive as a business, you do. And if you aren't going to survive because maybe your product is bad or you just aren't a good manager of a company, then your company is going to die off. And that's okay, right? That was the idea at the time. So, the idea of how we should be using money, how we should be exchanging goods, leads to this new study of the economy. And Karl Marx was one of these men who were very invested in how we use our money is later going to affect society and how humans even interact with each other. Karl Marx was known for writing the Communist Manifesto, where he believed that if different social classes continue to fight against one another, it's eventually going to lead to a world where all production is owned by the community. Okay, so everyone owns everything, right? That later leads to some ideas about communism, and we see governments take up this idea. In a perfect world where everything works right, maybe this would work, but as we're going to see in a couple of weeks, communism and this idea that Karl Marx had didn't always play out how it should have. As you guys know, I like to always see what was the role of women in the world during this time. So, as mentioned before, women were here to take care of the home and the children. They did not go and work. If you were a part of the middle class or upper class, you didn't work because your husband made enough money for you. And instead, at home, you tended on the meals, you tended on the children, took care of the home, organized where your workers were going to be for the day, those things like that. But not everyone stood for this, right? Women are individuals, they have their own interests, they want to be involved in society. And so we start to see different women's groups spring up. So women are interacting with other women in their communities, they're sharing ideas, and they want to have a voice in some way or another. So, with these different women's rights groups starting to spring up, they're fighting for things. They're fighting for equality among the genders, such as the right to own property, the right for marriage equality. And when I say marriage equality at this time, what I'm talking about is, are you allowed to open a bank? Are you allowed to have the same voting rights as your male counterparts? Are you allowed to get an education? Things like that is what they were really fighting for during this time. So, out of this women's rights movements, we see actually two amendments get added to our government constitution here in the United States. The first is the temperance movement. This is the fight against alcohol sales. During this time, women were experiencing a lot of abuse back at home, and so they believed that by removing alcohol from the equation, their husbands would come home with a clearer head and they wouldn't be experiencing the abuse at their husband's hands. Next, we have the suffrage movement, which is the fight for women to be able to vote here in the United States. They wanted a voice in political movements. They were citizens. They were affected by the laws just as much as everyone else. So they wanted to have a voice when it comes to decision making. Now, while the movement was successful in the end, it had a really rough start, especially because women, their ability to do community outreach and actually become involved in politics was very limited. They were not allowed to vote, and most of the time they weren't allowed to get an education, at least not an education in normal things like law, politics, banking, things like that. If you were going to college as a woman during this time, it was to become a teacher because that was really the only acceptable middle class job for a woman. During this time, we start to see public education really become a thing. So, you can thank the Industrial Revolution that you are currently listening to this video lecture. By the late 1800s, there were different educational reforms where we wanted to improve society, right? That's the main goal of all of the Industrial Revolution, is improving society and making things better. So in order to help the children in different parts of the country here in the United States, we start to see school buildings sprout up around the country. So having a basic education for children, being able to find a place where we can feed children that maybe don't have a great home life, things like that. So schools were set up pretty much at this time to just teach the basics. Okay, the education that you get today is much different than what the education was in the 1800s and early 1900s. Girls didn't really learn much other than home keeping skills. Okay, so they weren't in math classes, they weren't in science or even phys ed classes. Because at the time, again, it goes back to the idea of like, what are women going to be doing for society as they grow up? They're taking care of the home. So knowing how to cook, knowing how to sew, all of these different home taker skills, that's what they were learning in school. Boys, on the other hand, were learning those math, science, reading, writing, those kind of skills because it was expected of men that you were going to go out into the workforce and you would need those jobs in order to be successful. Because of this idea of public education, we see colleges really start to pop up during this time. As you guys maybe next year start getting into doing different college visits, pay attention to the dates that they were established. Most likely they're going to be in the mid 1800s to mid 1900s because again, it's that period of industrialization and wanting to improve society as a whole. And so that's really where colleges start. Now, in colleges, it was in order to, one, for women, you were learning how to become a teacher. Okay, if you were a woman, you went to college in order to become a teacher, and that was basically it. Even like Central Michigan University, that was a college originally for females to go to in order to learn how to be teachers. Okay, but otherwise, for the most part, college was expanding on ideas about history, writing, philosophy, law, because if you were getting a college degree in that, you were most likely going later on into being a doctor, a lawyer, a business owner, things like that. All right, guys, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for sticking with me. Again, we're starting to think big scale of how could the Industrial Revolution have led to this time period of World War One? Okay, so how can new inventions, the way society is working during this time, maybe even frustrations or ideologies, how could that later, decades down the road, lead to breakouts of war around the rest of the world? If you guys have any questions, please let me know.